Well, good morning. Being in the crucible with Christ is the theme this quarter. And I don't know about you, but that's not always an easy thing to comprehend or understand as a believer in Jesus Christ. We think at times that it's going to be smooth sailing going forward, but I've been enjoying better understanding what we go through and some of the trials and the experiences that we have in following Jesus. And this last week, our lesson study has been called Seeing the Goldsmith's Face. And so as part of this process, we begin to see a bit of ourselves changed to better reflect Jesus. And as part of that reflection, there's a process that we go through, and suffering is a big part of that. So to get started, I'm hoping one of our panelists would like to be willing to read our memory text from 2 Corinthians 3:18. I said one of the panelists. Yeah.
Okay, 2 Corinthians 3:18. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from glory to glory, just as by the Spirit of the Lord.
So we're being transformed. Is that an easy thing? Do you look in the mirror sometimes and say, I like what I see?
I do.
You do?
Yeah.
Yeah?
I mean, hello, can you hear me? No?
I think you can now. Go now.
Hello?
There you go.
I do sometimes look in the mirror and like what I see. I mean, don't we all sometimes? Like, as we should. You guys are beautiful. But the metaphorical mirror of looking at my character, yes and no. Because I am deeply flawed. However, I am growing, and I like that.
So it depends on what we put our focus on, somewhat. In the lesson study, or actually in this passage, Paul is talking about, and he's referring to Moses, when he saw the glory of the Lord and his face had to be veiled because they couldn't handle being that close or seeing his face from what he had been experiencing with God. And so when we go through this process, we're basically able to come forward to Jesus without a veil and be in his glory. What are the references that we can take away from that in terms of our own acknowledgement? Should we be suffering in the presence of Jesus?
I think that's an interesting question. Should we be suffering in the presence of Jesus? That's a really fascinating question. To go back to the mirror analogy there, when I look in the mirror and I look at myself, sometimes I agree. I like what I see. The problem is that when I compare myself to the Lord, I don't like what I see. And that's kind of painful. It's painful to know that I don't stand up to where I should be. That's difficult.
Yeah. I think it's important that we acknowledge that aspect of things within ourselves as well, because if we focus too much on one or the other, I think we're imbalanced within that approach. But how do we know then what we are supposed to be reflecting? Because in this whole process of being refined, the impurities, and it talks about in the lesson, are being removed. The dross is what it calls it. So we become changed, but how do we balance that focus to know that at the end of the day, here's what we should be moving towards?
I think it's like what you said earlier, what we focus on. If we're focusing on ourselves, we're going to see imperfection. But if we focus on Jesus, then it is by beholding him that we can become changed.
And in beholding him, do we then not see some of those impurities within our own character?
Yes. But it's not if my job is to reflect Jesus, right? My job is only to reflect Jesus. If I'm doing that imperfectly right now, I'm still doing what my responsibility is, which is reflecting Jesus. There's just a lot of sin and gunk in the way. God's job is to refine me so that I do that more perfectly. So I don't feel bad about the fact that there are impurities and imperfections there. I don't like it, but when I have an understanding of the gospel, I am grateful that I am in the hands of someone whose responsibility it is to do the purifying. If it's my responsibility to do the purifying, I'm done. There's no good. But my only responsibility is to reflect Jesus.
From what I'm hearing and what I've experienced even within myself, there's that battle. But we can claim victory in that battle. But I think it's important that we acknowledge that within us there's this battle within about what are we going to follow? What are we going to focus on? Are we going to accept his love and his grace and his mercy and all of the gifts that he desires to give us?
And also, will we accept the suffering that he has to give us? And that's the launching point of our whole study this week. It's not that we are purified just so we can reflect Jesus, and we suffer so we can reflect Jesus. We suffer even as we reflect Jesus because he was a man of sorrow, acquainted with grief. If we're going to look like Jesus, we're going to look like people who are going through difficult things. And as it is refining our character, we'll display his character in the suffering more and more.
I had a question about the suffering, Steve. Can you help me out? Is the suffering strictly necessary? And all panelists here, not just Steve. Sorry, Steve. But seriously, like the question I get is, with the lesson, it delved heavily into that idea that suffering was necessary for the character development that brings us closer to God. And I guess my question is that strictly necessary to get us close to Jesus?
I can't answer that question of whether or not it's strictly necessary because it's above my pay grade. You know what I mean? Like that's a question for the Almighty, and I am not him. But James says in chapter 1 and verse 3 or 4, I believe, count it all joy when you fall into various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces patience, and let patience have its perfect work in you, that you may be whole and complete, lacking nothing, right? So the idea that James is trying to get across to us is that we will fall into various trials, tests, and temptations. Whether or not it's necessary, it's going to happen. And when it happens, we should consider it joy because of what it does produce.
So there's a mindset that we can have that helps us through whatever we're facing in suffering.
Absolutely.
Well, the question that I would bring back to Michael here is, was it necessary for Jesus to suffer? And if it was necessary for him to suffer, then I don't know that I would want to excuse myself from the same process. Yeah.
Well, as we become more refined, those impurities, the parts of our character that are in need of change, well, they become different. They become let go of. They're gone. They are removed in the process. And so then we do reflect his image more clearly than we did before. And what impact does that have on the people around us? What impact does our growth in Jesus have in just how we go about living our lives daily in relation to the people in our families or communities? It's a good question. But at the end of the day, I think...
Restate it for us.
Restate it.
Yes.
Oh, mercy. Okay. When it comes to the process of being refined, what impact does that have on the people around us? As we become changed, do we then act differently, and then does that impact them? Is there a ripple effect, so to say?
I would say yes, and I'm going to speak from the perspective of a teacher for a moment. When I am working with my students and I want them to behave in a certain way, I can tell them to behave, but it doesn't have the same impact as if I model that behavior for them. So I think when people see us living our lives a certain way and they see, I mean, God's face reflecting off of us, his light shining from our lives because we do have him within us and changing us, that they can only be influenced by that.
Yeah, I think there is an influence. Sometimes it doesn't go like you want it to go, though. I think as we get closer to God, or as we exhibit God's characters in our lives, I think that can be perceived in a variety of ways. Annoying is one of them. I'll give it just a little example. Sometimes I exemplify. I have 2 children, and they're 10 and 12 years old. And sometimes I exemplify God. Sometimes I don't. And sometimes when I try to correct a behavior in the way that I think that is good and is applicable, sometimes I get, well, Dad knows all this stuff. He knows everything. Blah blah blah. Sometimes it's not accepted, right?
I was just going to say, that's where we work in partnership with God, I think, because while we can live out that life, God is the one that impresses upon the heart. So it goes with prayer.
So I have to pray for my kids more. That's what you're saying. It's not me that needs prayer, right? It's my kids.
The village needs to pray for your kids.
You all should pray for my kids. Thank you.
All of our kids.
But isn't that what we go through? We will present the truth, we'll present something in love, but then there'll be a reaction. And their reaction will be what that individual is going through, because they are they get to choose whether or not they want to be refined or not, whether they're 3 or 33 or, 83. It makes no difference.
I think our process of refinement. Hello? Oh, okay, great. I think that when we are in the process of refinement, I do think that impacts others, but sometimes I think we get a little bit confused. I really like your analogy with your children, because that's a space where you are actively discipling people and training and teaching, right? I don't have any children, so I don't interact with people in the same way that you interact with your children, but there are some places where I do actively disciple and correct, and I can see how that's tricky as an imperfect human. However, outside of those spaces, right, where it is not my role or responsibility to actively rebuke, if I feel like I need to, then what I need to do is check to make sure that I'm reflecting Christ and it's not my imperfection that's coming out, right? And taking the log out of my own eye first before I might inadvertently harm somebody. We often say, you've heard the saying, hurt people, right? One of the things I like to say is heal people. The adverse is not entirely true because we don't have healing power, but when I go through the process of healing, that lets other people know that they are free to do the same, right? And that is inspiring to people who observe that. Or sometimes it can be annoying to people, like, who does she think she is, right? Why does she deserve to grow in those ways? I know who you used to be, right? But in the same way that harm doesn't happen in a vacuum, healing doesn't happen in a vacuum either, right? And if we are intentional about submitting to Christ in our healing, then there will be ripple effects in our relationships.
Yeah, that process of healing is important. It's what we need to go through. And for there to be lasting change in our character, I believe there also has to be a degree of adversity that makes that change lasting and genuine. Without it, that suffering that we go through, what is it for? Why do we, will it really stick without the suffering, I guess is what I'm saying. I just wanted to share a quote here from the Testimonies for the Church, Volume 4, pages 85 and 86. The purification of the people of God cannot be accomplished without their suffering. God permits the fires of affliction to consume the dross to separate the worthless from the valuable, that the pure metal may shine forth. He passes us from one fire to another, testing our true worth. And so out of this, there's an aspect of we have to be tested and refined along the way.
I think there's a misconception that healing feels good, right? And that healing doesn't, that there's no pain involved in healing. Because nothing could be further from the truth. Healing, it doesn't feel good. It's very painful because I'm shifting from what I'm used to into something different, right? So it actually feels awkward at best sometimes, right? But also, healing is not linear, right? That's why we have to die daily and why we have to submit ourselves daily. And we want to think that our Christian life goes like this, but it looks more like that. And it's just how it is. The process of healing is messy, and the process of healing includes suffering. So if we want to heal, it's a part of it.
I've been attending the young adult class or service in the evenings, and Pastor Fernandez, he had up on a slide something that just really fit with the lesson study this past week. What he said was, we can choose to suffer the pain of discipline or suffer the pain of regret. I'll just repeat that statement and then I'll open it up to see what your thoughts are. We can choose to suffer the pain of discipline or suffer the pain of regret. Those are our choices, really.
Well, and the fire, the metaphor of fire or crucible of, the precious metal goes in and has to be heated so hot that things that aren't the precious metal get burned up. The paradox of that is that that's not, that is, metaphorically, that's the bad things that we face. It's not the good things. It's not the good things that come and refine us. It's not us experiencing wonderful stuff. It's us experiencing the worst things. And so the paradox is that the bad things in our lives are used by God towards a good end. That they are what bring us face to face with, moment by moment, our moments of truth, of how do I respond? How am I going to have the strength to get through this? Am I going to make choices that I've made previously in this situation that have not ended up well? Or am I going to allow this see this as an opportunity for God to refine my character?
I just wanted to know if that saying was like proportional to our lunch today. Like, suffer the pain of discipline, like I got to eat properly, or suffer the pain of regret, like I ate 4 pieces of chocolate cake and I regret that. Does it fit with food too?
I think so. Yeah. 4 pieces of chocolate cake. That's it. Yeah.
That actually makes me think of something else I was thinking of earlier. Just the idea that the things that are not necessarily good for us in our life and in our character often feel good. And, you know, temporarily they seem like great things, and the removing of them is what's painful, but in the end we feel better.
I'm just going to read here from Romans 8, verses 28 to 30. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to his purpose. For whom he foreknew, he also predestined to be conformed to the image of his Son, that he might be the firstborn among many brethren. Moreover, whom he predestined, these he also called. Whom he called, these he also justified. And whom he justified, these he also glorified. So are we being glorified or changed as we suffer?
It's interesting. It's interesting that in the structure of the Gospel of John, there are two major sections in John. The first is called the Book of Signs, and the second is called the Book of Glory, which is an interesting name given to it by scholars, the Book of Glory, because John's constantly talking about the glorification of Jesus. And what is that? It's his suffering and his death, and then his resurrection. But the glory of God is, again, doesn't look on the outside like a good thing, always.
So it comes back to that mindset that we have in acknowledging the battle that's going all around us right now, the great controversy, and what we choose to do in the midst of it. Yes. So how do we keep our faith while we might be going through this? What do we do to stay strong and stand firm while this goes on? This isn't exactly something we enjoy at times. So what do we do?
What did Jesus do? He went and spent a lot of time with the Father in prayer. I think that's important.
And I think the lesson also brought out the idea of community. The church was a heavy topic in the lesson this week. And I think it goes back to the idea that community is what keeps us whole. It's what constantly is chipping away at our own forms or desires for self-sufficiency, which can lead to undesirable traits and stuff like that. I think community really chips off those edges.
Mm-hmm. So iron sharpens iron. It's true. I've been thinking a bit. This has been really nice to have camp meeting. To have something where we all get to gather again. We get to be in worship together and growing, and just the joys of camp as well. But we didn't have that for 2 years. And so we were going through different varying degrees of suffering with what was going on around us in the world. And I don't mean to be negative or anything like that, but it's going to get worse in ways. But what are we going to choose to do in the midst of that? How do we continue to keep our faith strong? How do we change our foundation from an earthly one to one that is a heavenly one? And that's part of the process of being refined. It's that choice. Are we going to choose to suffer discipline? Or are we going to eventually choose to suffer regret later? And so then I'd like to bring up Job. I don't necessarily, we always think of Job and suffering, but I don't necessarily think of Job and refining. Does that compute? Does that balance out? Any thoughts?
Well, the difficulty with thinking of refining in Job's story is he's not presented as someone who is in need of refinement. He's presented as someone who's walking closely with God already, and there's a testing that comes. And I guess this gets back to Mike's question, is it necessary? And maybe even if we're just totally right with God, suffering still is part of the equation.
Yeah, and that's Job presents a bit of an issue, a bit of a conflict in my brain, at least, because if I come back to the idea that we were created in God's image, and it says it right in the first day, I think it was Sunday or Monday of the lesson, that it said, but sin changed that. So what part of God's image does sin have the power to change? I just, and that's kind of, that goes back to Job. Like, if Job was this perfect being, why was it necessary? Why did you have to do it?
Was he perfect?
I mean, I don't know. I don't think so. But the Bible presents him as an almost perfect person.
Yeah, well, and I'm trying to remember where I read somewhere, if it was I think it was in the lesson somewhere, it talked about how that suffering, that refining process can bring out imperfections in us that we might not have recognized we had. So I thought that was kind of an interesting thought, and maybe that's the way it was for Job.
I think also some tests and trials serve the purpose of approving, right? Like if you're taking a class, well, we're doing Education Sabbath School today, so if you're taking a class and you have learned all the material, when you take the test, it's an exciting day because you know it. And you're going to go in, and what one of my professors would say that I would do is write an entire epistle of all of the information that I already knew. And sometimes I would put stuff in the margins just in case I got extra marks, right? Because I studied and I knew the material, right? This summer, I said my mantra is embracing chaos, because there was already a lot of chaos and I was fighting against it, and that was hard. So I was like, maybe I'll just go with it. I'll only control what I can control, and everything else that happens will happen. And then last week, Monday, got into a car accident and totaled my car. Yeah. And everyone was like, are you okay? I was like, no, I'm fine. Are you okay? Yeah, I'm fine. Are you shaken? No, I'm fine. I walked out of the car. The airbag didn't deploy. The other guy's fine. Like, we're okay. I lost a little bit of range of motion, but insurance is sending me to the chiropractor. I'm fine. And like, I'm really fine, right? Is it a hard experience? Yes. Is dealing with insurance while at camp meeting difficult? Yes. Is having to go to 3 doctor's appointments a week during camp meeting difficult? Yes. But I'm actually okay, right? And if not for the test, I wouldn't know that I would be able to withstand it. So sometimes we need to have a broader understanding of what all of the tests are for, right? In Job's case, he was right. He was just. And the test showed that he was just.
And beyond that, I think to the point of the book of Job, it wasn't really ever Job's character that was the issue.
Exactly.
The fire demonstrated God's character and just demonstrated God's justice. And maybe sometimes it's not about us as we go through things. It's not about, this is what you need to grow here through this fire, but rather I need to reveal myself. And the only way that I can do that is through a very difficult situation, that you'll see something about me as your Heavenly Father that you just didn't see before.
Yes.
And also, I believe, to a witness to others, like to Job's friends. I hope and believe they would have learned something through that experience and what they had witnessed with Job. And so when we go through trials, when we go through suffering, we have the witness that we can bear it and it's not really hurting us, like Pastor Jourdain was mentioning with her experience. But that can be a witness to others as well. And so the building up of the community of believers or others around us, what we go through, whether it be a suffering that is, easy to bear or not easy to bear, whether it be a suffering of our own refinement of character or understanding God more, it can have an impact on those around us. Should we suffer for others then? I'm seeing some nods. So it's a rhetorical? Okay.
I don't like the word should.
Okay. Yes.
Because I feel like should is a fantasy word, Should, like, I can't really tell somebody what they should do unless it's something they actually could do, right? Can we suffer for others? Like, can I actually suffer in your place and you experience the benefit of that suffering?
It's an interesting question, of course. When we suffer, I'm going to think back to my parents. I'm sure if I were to really talk to them, there are things that they suffered through with me to help me learn and grow in that I had no clue about that they were suffering through. And I was just along the way, but that's part of that shepherding, that guiding, that loving. And so I believe that we don't suffer the same way because, as the lesson says on Friday, character is not transferable. We can't transfer good character, God's character, to someone else. But we can either help them or harm them along their journey. And so that aspect of loving our neighbor, building them up, or whether it just be a loved one or even a member of the church or just a friend or a coworker.
Can I challenge that a little bit?
Yes.
I think character is transferable.
Okay.
Jesus' character is transferable.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why he's the only one who was able to suffer for us, right? And transfer to us the benefit of that suffering that he went through, right? When I'm baptized, I'm crucified with Christ. And that's a real spiritual reality. But I'm not Jesus, so I can suffer alongside you. I can walk with you and bear your burdens, but I don't think I can suffer for someone.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I'm just going to read a quote here as we are wrapping up from Friday. Character building is the most important work ever entrusted to human beings, and never before was its diligent study so important as now. I think that's just something we can take away, that this character building we're going through is very important, and it is for our good, and that we can trust that it will be for our good, even if we cannot see it in the moment that we're in.